Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to Going Live with the Global Science Show. I'm in the middle of having like a little bit of a battle with a bearded dragon to my left, who has decided that now we've went live, he is going to just like go crazy and run around in his tank and make lots of noise. So if you can hear it, that weird scrabbling noise, that's what's going on. My name is Sam Langford. For those of you who haven't been here before, welcome to Going Live with Global Science Show. The Global Science Show is a monthly virtual science festival that allows science communicators all around the world to share a little slice of science with a global audience through Twitter, through Facebook, and a couple of other platforms as well. Today, we are going to meet a science communicator, and we're going to talk about who they are, what they do, and why they're awesome. We'll be here for around half an hour, and we'll have a really nice chat over a cuppa. I'm on to coffee number 3 today, which is getting me through quite a busy day. So very much needed. If you get any questions for me or for our guest, you can do that using, if you're watching on Twitter, through Periscope or through YouTube as well. Loads of ways that you can get in touch. So it is time to bring our guest on. Everyone, please say hello to Michael Marshall.
Hello. Hi, Sam. Nice to meet you again.
Oh, and you. Thank you so much for coming to have a chat with us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So first question I always ask when people come on is quite simply, who are you and what do you do?
My name is Michael Marshall and I'm a science writer. So I'm freelance, so I'm not employed by any one publication. I write for a range of different people. I write for New Scientist, the BBC, Nature, and a range of other places. And I write mostly about biology, so life sciences, and the environment, which is a pretty broad spectrum of things to be writing about. So that's anything from sort of animal behavior and sort of paleontology, evolutionary biology, through things like human biology, human evolution, mental health, the virus. Obviously, that's cropped up a few times, and into things like climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, energy sources. It's kind of a long list. But yeah, life sciences and the environment is generally how I try and sum it up.
It's like a huge broad scope though, but that must mean that there's like so many different interesting topics that you get to like research and think about and write about.
Well, yeah, I mean that's kind of a big part of the appeal of doing it, really. You know, when I like a lot of people after I sort of finished my undergraduate degree, I tried to do a PhD and I kind of didn't succeed at it, mostly because I didn't have the kind of I suppose you could call it patience. You could also call it just sort of sheer stubborn bloody mindedness to stick at the same narrow subject for 3 years. And I after like 1 year, I sort of found that I was done. I wanted to do something really different. So being a science writer gives me the opportunity to sort of still dig into this subject, these subjects that I'm kind of in love with and fascinated by, but just sort of range much more broadly, rather than having to worry about one protein for 3 years, which can be what PhD is like.
Yeah, I really do admire the people that are able to make it through like that, like one very specific niche subject for quite a long time. But I'm like you, I get very bored very quickly with the same sorts of subjects. Yeah. So yeah, I can completely sympathize with that. How have you spent your pandemic?
Writing mostly. So I already, because I'm freelance, I already worked from home. So that side of it was actually not like a huge adjustment to me. Having to homeschool my daughter, that was one hell of an adjustment, as I think it has been for many people. And all I can say is that thank heavens my wife is a qualified teacher, because it would have been 10 times worse otherwise. But I mean, I've been writing, I've just been sort of writing and working all the way through it, really. So I've written quite extensively about COVID, about sort of various aspects of it, from like the biology of the virus itself into things like the psychology of human reactions to crises and why it is that some governments, some leaders have sort of been seemingly unable to respond quickly and effectively to a crisis, while others have just seemingly nailed it. And then on to my sort of major interest at the moment is long COVID, so the chronic debilitating disorder that many people get after they've passed through the acute initial infection stage. I think that's sort of an underappreciated aspect of it. I mean, a lot of people seem to almost not even believe that it exists, or not to factor it into their calculations when they think about, how should we be dealing with this virus. But the evidence is now pretty clear that about 1 in 10 people who become infected with the virus will go on and get long COVID. And so that is a very, very major public health toll, and it's something that should be being taken a lot more seriously and thought about more carefully when we decide how we're handling the virus over the next few years.
It's a really interesting situation for us to be in. We had a guest last week, Faye Watson from the University of Glasgow's Centre for Virus Research, and we were talking about long COVID and the way that clinicians don't really know what it actually means, and therefore the people who are suffering with long COVID right now are going to shape this whole kind of clinical the way that we respond. So it's a really, really interesting time. Now, you also mentioned about homeschooling. Your wee one has taken part in the Global Science Show multiple times, which has been really exciting.
She has indeed. Yeah, I know. I have to. Yeah, Libet has done several videos for the Global Science Show. Now, I have to admit, I have actually very little to do with any of that. It's mostly her and her mum. I think largely because the prospect after having spent like 10 hours a day working on like science articles and stuff, the prospect of then having to make a video as well is kind of like the busman's holiday, and it's almost the last thing I want to have to do. So, as a sort of addendum to my day. But she's made some amazing videos. I'm super proud of her. She's a bright and enthusiastic little bunny, and very hardworking.
Oh. Yeah, and it clearly comes across as well that the content that comes out in those videos is shaped by her, and the ideas that are in there, and the kind of the eloquence with which it's delivered as well is just really, really exciting as well. To see just how well formed the ideas are, and the questions that she asks people as well. It's great.
She's a very, very sharp little bunny. For one so young. I am slightly scared that she will either take over the world or destroy it, and I'm not entirely sure which one it's going to be, but one way or another the world will be impacted.
Time will tell exactly what's going to happen there. So you mentioned that you do writing for publications like New Scientist, but you also have your own book, which has come out over the past couple of months as well.
That's right. Yes, my book is called The Genesis Question. I have it here. I was prepared for this. It came out in the UK last summer, and then in the US sort of towards the end of last year, and it will be out in paperback later this year. So it's the story of the scientists who've been trying to solve one of the biggest mysteries there is, which is how life on Earth began. So, what is it that happened billions of years ago that turned a ball of rock and water and not much else into a place that suddenly has living cells and plants and trees and elephants and aardvarks and so forth. What was it that happened, and why did it happen here and not anywhere else? And what is the sort of underlying process that allows non-living matter to turn into living matter? And it's sort of one of those questions that's kind of quietly obsessed me for a long time. And it's one of the things that I've always written about in my sort of journalistic career. And what happened as I sort of wrote more and more stories about it was I got kind of increasingly frustrated, because there are so many different ideas about how life might have begun and where it might have begun. And because they're all quite complicated, in a 2,000 word feature, which is normally what you've got to work with, you can only really do one of them. So you just sort of wind up dismissing all the others in a sentence somewhere in the early going, so that you can talk about this one idea. And I really wanted to write something that would actually look at all the different ideas and explain how they'd arisen, who thought of them, when did they sort of first come to prominence, what's the evidence that supports them, what's the evidence that maybe suggests that they don't work, and how has the field changed? Are we sort of still stuck in a total quagmire of uncertainty, or are we actually at a point where we're starting to get a little bit more clarity over what happened? So that was kind of that was the motivation for doing it. I really wanted to. It was a book that I really wanted to be able to read, and it didn't exist. So I thought, well, I'll write it then.
That's a pretty good way to go. I really want that. It doesn't. It's not there. So let's just make it happen. I won't get you to go to spoil too much of what's actually in there. But reading about like where the story begins. It begins like back in 1920s in the Soviet Russia.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah. What sorts of things were they trying to figure out then?
Well, even back in those days, there was really only a handful of people that were thinking seriously about it. So it starts in Soviet Russia with a Russian scientist named Alexander Ivanovich Oparin, who was the first person to put forward an idea that was taken seriously by a large number of people. You know, there had been hypotheses put forward before, but most of them had sort of either kind of vanished without trace or was sort of, you know, quickly dismissed or whatever. Oparin's idea got taken seriously, and it eventually led 3 decades later to first actual proper experiments to try and sort of recreate the origin of life. And his idea is what we would now call the primordial soup. So the idea that the ocean of the Earth billions of years ago became very rich in carbon-based chemicals, and they sort of accumulated, and so it eventually became sort of thick and gloopy like soup. And that was sort of created conditions for more and more complicated structures to form, and eventually something that was the beginnings of simple life. And that eventually then led in the early 1950s to the first sort of really prominent experiment to sort of try and recreate this experiment called the Miller-Urey experiment, where essentially a young American chemist did a very, very simple experiment where he just sort of put a set of 4 chemicals in a sort of glass apparatus, and one of them was water, which was meant to simulate the ocean, and there were 3 others that were meant to be the air. And he heated the water and he shocked the air with little electric shocks to simulate lightning. And after about a week of this, he was able to produce some of the chemicals that we now know are essential to life. So that was a really dramatic demonstration that, you know, maybe the sort of barrier between non-living chemicals and living structures maybe wasn't quite as sort of hard and fast as we'd sort of tend to think, that maybe there could actually be some sort of way to get from one to the other. But that's kind of only the start of the story, because it turns out that just making a few chemicals is really not enough to make a living organism.
Yeah. And where have we gotten to now? Like, what's the kind of current research looking like? I know that's like a big question.
It is big, yeah. I think the big thing that's happened is that for a lot of the latter half of the 20th century, the way that scientists tried to solve this problem was that they sort of thought, well, yeah, living things are incredibly complicated, and there's no way that all these sort of different complicated systems can all have arisen together. So they would sort of say, okay, well, let's try and really strip it back, and let's imagine that just one bit of life came first, and then everything else kind of accumulated around it. So you often hear of ideas where like the genes come first, like some sort of genetic material, whether it's DNA or generally it's RNA, which is a sort of close cousin of DNA. But you imagine that there were these a lot of ideas where a simple genetic molecule arises and starts to copy itself, and everything else kind of forms around that. And what's become increasingly clear, I think, is that those sorts of ideas don't actually work, because you sort of fundamentally you only get so far with one bit of life. You really actually do need several of the key bits of life to have all formed together and to start working together pretty much from the get-go. And so a lot of the modern studies are looking at, well, just how many of the different chemicals of life can we actually get from the same starting materials? Can we get lots of different kinds of things? Can we get proteins and RNA and fats? Can we get all of that from the same starting materials? And what happens if we start putting them together? What kinds of behaviors do we start to see? You know, can we make something that actually starts to look a little bit like a simple living cell? And there are some amazing experiments where they just take essentially sort of fat-like chemicals and RNA and nothing much else, and put them together, and you get these things called protocells, which really behave startlingly similarly to living cells when you consider how much simpler they are in terms of the number of chemicals that are involved. Yeah, it's definitely not a resolved question, and there's certainly a huge amount of uncertainty as to like where it happened, like what kind of environment, exactly when it happened. There's a gap of about 1 billion years when it could have happened. Just excuse me 1 second, that's the phone. So I will just hang up.
The nature of the world we're living in right now, isn't it?
Yeah, I know. I say the cat would wander in if I hadn't like shut this door. But yeah, there are these. Yeah, while we don't know exactly where it happened or when it happened, and there's still a huge amount of debate and discussion going on as does the kind of pathways and the mechanisms by which it happened. I think we've sort of, what has happened is that scientists have eliminated a lot of options that previously seemed promising, and they've sort of that's shunted them off into this slightly more, I hate the word holistic because it sometimes seems a little bit wishy-washy, but there's slightly more completist version where you're trying to bring together several aspects, several components of life all together.
No, it definitely seems like it's a book that's going to cover a lot of ground, I imagine. But like not a bad thing at all, because there is so much to talk about this question. Yeah.
I think I wind up ranging from biology and chemistry and geology, and there is a bit of physics in there. There's a bit of thermodynamics. But there's also a lot of just stories of the individual scientists and the ways that they came up with these ideas and the kinds of people that they were. So, I mentioned Oparin, and of course, he was operating in Soviet Russia, and which was at the time a totalitarian dictatorship. And then later on, the Cold War and the space race starts to play a big role in driving this research. And a lot of them are just sort of really fascinating characters. I mentioned the Miller-Urey experiment. Well, Stanley Miller, the guy who did that, was this very, very creative, very capable guy. But he was also, on his own account, not actually a very good experimenter. He sort of tried, before he did this experiment, he tried to do a completely theoretical PhD because he thought, oh God, if I actually have to work with like practical things and do them, they'll just explode. And he was also, I can sort of tell you almost everything you need to know about Stanley Miller when I tell you that he was very, very into steam trains, like really, really into steam trains. I think he may have been a little bit socially awkward, but he seems to have been a very, very creative person.
Those sorts of stories, and I know that like it's the things that really resonate with people is the science is like great. And like facts are interesting, but they're not the things that kind of bring people along. It is the stories about the people doing it and whatnot. So that sounds like a really good angle to have taken on. Like, who are these people? Why would they come up with these ideas?
I mean, I was very much inspired by other writers when I decided to do it that way. The Invention of Nature by Andrea Wolf is one of my favorite books of the last 10 years. And that's about Alexander von Humboldt, the sort of naturalist and explorer. And so it's full of, the science of, of biology, of early evolutionary thinking, of ecology. But it's also the story of him rampaging around South America and getting into all these kinds of scrapes. And, and it's the way that those two things are woven together that I think made it a really compelling story.
Oh, that's great. Something else that just kind of popped into my head is that when an author releases a book, you expect there to be kind of events that go alongside it, going to literary festivals and book festivals, and that, I guess. I don't know. Is it something you've been able to do? Like with
the benefit of hindsight, 2020 hindsight, so to speak, it is just possible that launching a book in the middle of a century-level pandemic was not optimal timing. I have done events, but they've entirely been online. It's all been sort of I've been invited by a number of like wonderful science festivals and places like that who have been and podcasts and radio shows, but I haven't met anyone in person. In fact, I still haven't met my editor in person.
Oh wow!
Because we just because of the nature of the timings of it. By the time that we were working together properly, the pandemic was well and truly underway, and so we even at this point, I only know her as a presence on Zoom.
It's
weird. We had a book launch, which was essentially me and my immediate family. And we had a cake, and I had some fizzy wine, but I haven't been able to sort of there's been an awful lot of things that I as yet haven't been able to do. I'm hoping I might be able to do some of it to support the paperback launch later this year, but I'm very much crossing fingers for that I might actually get to see someone in person and like sign a copy of a book in person, as opposed to signing a little book plate and sending it through the post, which is what I've been doing.
Oh well, it's looking more and more likely that we're going to start getting events like that back again, which it'll be so good to have those sorts of things. Like the Edinburgh Book Festival, I miss it a lot. It's something that I would love to go to when the Fringe and the international festivals on. But good that there's still been that kind of digital presence for events as well.
Yeah.
That has been invaluable for a lot of different
very much
industries.
so.
It'd be nice to talk about like the process of getting to having a published piece, a published book. Because I know there's a lot of people that follow Global Science Show and take part that are fairly early on in careers, but would be interested in science writing. So how do you go about writing a book and becoming a published author?
So, I mean, there isn't like one way to do it, but if you're writing a non-fiction book, you basically don't write the book and then try to submit it to publishers. You write like a proposal for a book and try and get that accepted for a publisher first, which is the complete opposite of what happens with fiction. Yeah, normally with a novel, you'll write the whole thing and then send it to them. Non-fiction publishers will basically just ignore you if you do that. So that what they want to see is a proposal. So a document of like a few pages long that will sort of explain what the book's going to be about, how it's going to tell it, how it's going to be structured, how it compares to other books that are similar books that are on the market. What distinguishes this one? Why should this one exist? And generally, the best way I would say to sort of go about doing that is to get yourself a literary agent, so someone who will represent you to the publisher. So they will advise you on your proposal. They'll get my agent Peter Tallock, he gave me someone else's proposal from a book that was successfully published some years ago. So I had like a model to work from. And I wrote my proposal, and then he basically sent it back covered in red ink and said, this bit's too long, this bit's too waffly. You need to big up this aspect. You need to emphasize the stories of the scientists more. You're sort of focusing too much on the scientists. All this advice, and then once the proposal was in a really good shape, the other thing that the agent will then do is that they know all of the editors. They know at all the different publishing companies, from the most massive conglomerates to those little indie ones. They know who the main editors are that are going to be potentially interested in this particular book, and so they know exactly who to pitch it to, and they also know how to deal with the contracts and the negotiations around that. The trouble is that particularly when you're a first-time author, you kind of just really want to get a deal, and you'll probably settle for too little because you just want, oh my god, I just want to get a book deal. Whereas because an agent who is representing dozens of people and has a little bit more distance on it will just be, well, this deal actually isn't very good. And we'll negotiate and sort of get it up and make a difference to either the amount of money that you're being paid or just the terms of the contract in general. Get yourself an agent and listen carefully to all the advice that they give you is a key thing, and then just be prepared for the fact that it's a long process. I think I started talking to Peter in late 2017, and the book came out in 2020. I'll still be doing things to do with the paperback edition well towards the end of this year, possibly even longer. So, it's not just a case of writing the book; it's all the preparation that you need to do to write the proposal, to get to write the book, and then all the promotion that you have to do to persuade people to actually buy the book. So it's it'll probably wind up being about 5 years. By the time the whole cycle has sort of reached its conclusion.
You remember when we said at the start about PhDs and those lasted for 3 or 4 years?
Yeah, but at least with this, I do get to do other things alongside it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's a really good overview of kind of the book aspect, but someone who is interested in science writing, so whether that is more kind of journalistic articles or similar ideas like that, what sorts of things would you recommend to someone who's looking to try and get involved that way?
I would recommend 2 things. First of all, just start writing as soon as you possibly can. So if you're at high school or at university, just start writing for your high school magazine, newspaper, whatever is available, whatever is there. If there isn't something there, start it. And don't worry if a lot of the early stuff that you write is a bit rubbish. It will be. like I dread to think what my sort of earliest efforts are like. I must admit I haven't gone back and looked at them. I'd probably get absolute conniptions if I did. But you need to get into that habit of writing regularly and of hitting deadlines, right? You know, if you're writing for a newspaper or a magazine, they will have deadlines, and you have to hit them unless like something bad, unless something major has happened. I did go over deadline with the book. I had to get a 2-week extension on the deadline because I had a really bad case of flu just as I was coming up to the deadline. There was just no way I could get it done. But even then, it was only 2 weeks on a year-long deadline, and that's one of the very few times that I've ever needed to ask for an extension. And so, that sort of discipline of like writing regularly, hitting your word count, actually making the article about the thing that you've said that it was going to be, and not just sort of going off and writing some completely other random thing that sort of struck you along the way. All that kind of discipline you can learn on like student publications. And then once you actually start trying to write professionally, just get paid immediately is the other one, because a lot of publications will sort of say to you, oh, you know, we're not going to pay you, we'll give you exposure. Well, thanks. No. Exposure will not pay your rent. So just reject them out of hand and go and write for someone who will actually give you money. A lot of publications will now have paid internships where you can sort of go in for a month or 3 month or whatever period it is, and they will give you on the job experience of actually working in a newsroom alongside experienced journalists, and you will be writing and editing stuff from them. And I know that New Scientist has an internship like that, and I saw that the Times has quite recently offered. I think it's actually a kind of apprenticeship type scheme, which is a fantastic step forward. What has tended to happen is that a lot of these internships were classically unpaid, and so that basically meant that you could only get them if you had the bank of mum and dad to support you, which of course just led to the industry becoming very, very dominated by people who could afford to do that for 6 months. And it shouldn't be like that. You should be getting paid for your work straight away. And so get paid. Don't take no for an answer. The initial rates might be rubbish, but get the money.
I think that's like another thing that it's a problem across like science communication, not just within science writing aspect of it as well, is that people having to do things for the exposure, which is like rubbish, and also knowing what is a good and a bad rate as well. I know that yesterday there was a news story about Boris Johnson's articles in the Telegraph. He was getting £5 per word, which is like a huge rate, and I've sort of people say like 50 pence per word.
I mean, like I've regularly accepted rates of around about 50 pence a word. If people are paying me much less than that, I'll only accept it if it's something that I can do relatively quickly and easy. So the way that I don't actually much like the idea of being paid per word, because it's actually really easy to run up the word count. Any idiot can just bang on in an excessively lengthy sentence that basically makes the point that it's easy to run up the word count. So the way that I try to think of it when I'm sort of trying to manage my finances is to try and think about how much I'm getting paid per hour. And so if someone's paying me a sort of relatively low rate for an article, I think, well, okay, that I might still take it, but that means you're only going to get a certain amount of time. So I might, I might only do a certain number of interviews before I do the article. And then I just think to myself, well, can I actually do this properly on the basis of, say, 2 or 3 interviews, or do I really need to talk to like 8 or 10 people? And then that sort of helps me decide what I'm going to accept or what I'm going to choose to. Once I know that a publication has that sort of rate, it just shapes what I'll pitch to them. I'll only pitch to them, know that it's something I can pretty easily do in a day or whatever. Whereas other publications do have higher rates. The sort of the target in the industry has always been the mythical £1 a word. I don't think I've managed to find myself on £1 a word just yet from anyone, although I'm quite close to it with one publication who recently upped my word rate. But yeah, it's try and think of. I would sort of suggest that you think about it in terms of your time. How long did I have to spend on this? If you've had to spend a week on it, you should be you should be getting paid upwards of £1,000. As a sort of eyeballing it sort of figure.
Yeah.
I mean, Boris Johnson's rate was just openly ridiculous. I think it was £250,000 a year was what he was being paid, and then if you calculated that down to the fact that he only wrote a weekly column, it was some ludicrous, absolutely ridiculous sum. I mean, the fact is that for £250,000 you could employ 5 experienced journalists, because starting salaries even for somewhere like for quite a good publication, somewhere that that actually produces decent stuff as opposed to just a load of sort of clickbait nonsense. Starting salaries there might be around about 30,000 mark. If you're going somewhere else, it might be as low as 20. 50,000 is quite a 50,000 a year is quite a high salary for a journalist. So yeah, Boris Johnson's salary would have paid for about 5. Which is the other lesson, by the way. Don't go into it if you're expecting to get rich. Like, it is not a good path towards wealth. I mean, a very small handful of journalists and science writers do become very wealthy and command very high rates, but they are absolutely in the minority. I'm probably somewhere above the average in terms of the kinds of rates that I can command now, but that's because partly because I've been doing it for 13 years. Because unfortunately so many people want to do it, because it's sort of, a lot of people think it'd be a really exciting and fun thing to do, which it is. That necessarily kind of means that the power lies with the people who are employing you rather than necessarily with the people who are supplying the work.
Thank you so much. We've gone over time, which is absolutely fine, but it's been like fantastic to have you come and have a chat with us today. There's like lots of really good hints and tips, and the last thing I'm going to do as well is just say that if people want to find out more about you, I've put your Twitter handle in there, and also a link to where you can learn more about Michael's book, The Genesist's Quest, on his website. Yeah, thank you so much for coming to have a chat.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. It's been fun.
No, I'm going to use the power that I have to kick you out of the room. So thank you so much again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Oh, like that was so much fun. That was a great half-an-hour chat, and it went so quickly. I didn't realize that we were over half past at that point. We will be back again with some more guests next week. Thank you so much to everybody who's been watching today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope there's lots of interesting things for you to take forward from today. Anything else I wanted to say? We are looking for people to take part in our next Global Science Show, which is in round about a month. We've got a bit more of a gap in between our two shows just now. The next one is our biodiversity bonanza, which I can't say very quickly, where we will be showcasing the natural world. So we'll be talking about animals, plants, fungi, lots of things that way. So if you want to be involved, the links are on our Twitter page. We'll put them below this post on YouTube and on Twitter as well. In the meantime, folks, stay safe, take care, and we'll see you again next